Hello, friends, this is my true story, so watch till end. My name is Casey and Williams, and if you had asked me a year ago what fear sounded like, I would have told you it had a voice. Wind against steel, creaking beams, the tremor of a structure under pressure. That was the world I knew. 40 years as an architect teaches you how to listen to the hidden warnings inside walls, inside foundations, inside the places people call safe. But nothing in those decades of blueprints and calculations prepared me for the silence waiting inside my own home. I reached my street just as the last smear of daylight slipped behind the rooftops. The evening was unnervingly still, the kind of quiet that presses on your ears until every footstep feels too loud. My house sat at the end of the block, a place that should have been glowing with warmth at that hour. I expected to see the porch light on, maybe even hear Natalia's laughter drifting through the kitchen window while her husband, Anthony Reed, bragged about whatever business deal had inflated his ego that week. Instead, the entire house was dark, a dead, heavy darkness. I paused at the walkway, my keys cold in my hand. Something felt wrong before I even set foot on the steps. The air itself seemed to pull back from me, as if the night already knew what waited inside. When I unlocked the door and stepped in, the emptiness hit me like a physical force. "Nat," I called out. "Anthony." My voice echoed back, unchallenged. No footsteps, no answering laugh, no soft shuffle from the living room. Just the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, a lonely mechanical heartbeat in a home that suddenly felt abandoned. I dropped my suitcase. The thud ricocheted through the hollow space. Too loud, too sharp. Mail lay scattered on the dining table, casual and careless. Among the envelopes, one stood out, white, crisp, and stamped with a logo I recognized instantly. St. Mary's Hospital. For a moment, everything in me went cold. I reached for the envelope with hands that felt strangely disconnected from my body. My fingers trembled as I tore it open. The paper inside unfolded with a sound far too soft for the devastation it carried. Notice of admission. Patient, Natalia Williams. Date, 5 days prior. 5 days. I had been gone for less than a week. Less than a week, and my daughter had been admitted to a hospital I hadn't even known she entered. I stared at the words until they blurred. My throat tightened, a pressure I couldn't swallow down. I grabbed my phone and dialed her number. It rang, and rang, and rang. Straight to voicemail. I called Anthony next. Nothing. Again. Nothing. The silence in that house grew heavier, like a storm cloud thickening above me. "Please," I whispered to no one. "Just answer." But no one did. A surge of dread pushed me into motion. I snatched my keys off the counter, nearly knocking over the stack of mail, and rushed out the door. The drive to St. Mary's was a blur. Neon signs smeared into streaks of color. Streetlights flashed like warning signals. Every red light felt like torture, every turn too slow. By the time I reached the hospital, my hands were slick against the steering wheel. At the reception desk, a nurse looked up with practiced calm. I told her my name, then Natalia's. Something flickered across her face, an expression she tried to hide, but didn't hide fast enough. That was when I knew. She directed me toward the ICU with a quiet, cautious kindness that made my chest tighten even more. When I stepped into the intensive care unit, the world narrowed. The hiss of oxygen, the steady mechanical rhythm of ventilators, the harsh, sterile scent of antiseptic. My daughter lay there, still, fragile, swallowed by a cluster of machines. Her skin was too pale, her lips slightly parted. Tubes curled around her like vines claiming something once living. The monitors beside her pulsed with numbers I didn't understand, but each beep felt like a countdown. I couldn't breathe. I approached her slowly, afraid that if I touched her, she might vanish. I sat in the chair beside her and reached for her hand, warm but limp. No responding squeeze. No flicker of awareness. "Nat," my voice cracked. "Sweetheart, I'm here." I whispered the words I should have said more often when her life was quiet and ordinary. "I love you. I'm sorry. You're not alone anymore." The ventilator answered me with its steady, artificial breath. I watched her chest rise and fall, because I was terrified of what would happen if it didn't. Hours passed without shape. Doctors came and went with phrases like swelling, trauma, critical window. I absorbed their words the way one absorbs the details of a nightmare, half believing, half denying. When night fell, I didn't move from my chair. I sat there thinking of all the blueprints I'd drawn in my life, all the lines, all the structures designed to withstand storms. But none of them meant anything now. None could shelter her. None could fix what had been done. Around 3 a.m., exhaustion settled over me, but sleep refused to come. My mind replayed old memories. Natalia as a child building towers with her wooden blocks. Her first day of architecture school. The day she married Anthony. Her smile wide and hopeful, trusting a man I should have scrutinized harder. Time didn't soften the grief. It sharpened it. Into anger, into fear, into a haunting question. How had she ended up here? And why hadn't her husband come? Just after dawn, a nurse mentioned something that snagged in my mind. Her husband hasn't visited, she said, filling in a chart. Not once. Not even in passing. Not even to ask. That was when the first crack appeared in the story I had forced myself to believe. I stepped out into the hallway and called Anthony's office. A woman answered, her voice polite but hesitant. He's on personal leave, she said. Right after the accident. No explanation. No return date. I ended the call slowly, staring at my reflection in the screen. Tired eyes, clenched jaw, fear twisting into something colder. I spent the next hours at her bedside, but the unease wouldn't let go. It crept through my thoughts like a shadow that refused to stay behind me. By the time evening came again, one thing was clear. Something about the crash didn't add up, and Anthony was already running from the truth. That night, as the machines hummed and my daughter slept in a drugged, fragile stillness, I made my first silent vow. I will find out what happened to you. I will not let this darkness take you. And whoever put you in this bed will face the consequences of the life they tried to destroy. Morning slipped into the ICU like a reluctant guest, its thin pale light stretching across the tiled floor. I had been awake most of the night, watching Natalia's chest rise and fall, timing my breathing with hers, as if the universe might listen and keep her alive out of pity alone. But the longer I sat there, the more the pieces refused to fit together. 5 days in the hospital. 5 days without a single call. 5 days without her husband showing his face. People don't abandon the person they love in an ICU, unless love was never part of the equation. When a nurse stepped out for shift change, I quietly left the room and sat on a bench in the hallway. The overhead lights hummed softly, a lonely, buzzing reminder that life continued around me, even as mine had halted. I unlocked my phone. If Anthony wouldn't come to the hospital, I would go to him in whatever way I could. I remembered an account I had helped Natalia set up years ago. We'd created it together at the bank, a small safety net for emergencies. She'd shared the login with me back then, insisting it was just in case. The memory felt warm at the time. Now it felt like a lifeline. My fingers moved slowly across the screen, entering the credentials I hadn't touched in years. The account page loaded, and then the world tilted. Transaction after transaction filled the screen. Money pulled out in large, deliberate sums, beginning the morning after the crash. Thousands gone in a trail of withdrawals, like breadcrumbs leading away from responsibility. I scrolled faster, my heartbeat thudding in my ears. Why would he touch her emergency savings while she lay unconscious? Why would he even need it? Unless he was preparing to disappear. A coldness crawled down my spine. I needed someone who could see what I wasn't seeing. Someone who understood the darker corners of human intention. There was only one person I trusted with that task. I dialed Elliot Carter, an old friend and a retired detective. He answered with that steady voice that always made chaos feel manageable. "Send me everything," he said after listening to the details. I forwarded the screenshots. My hand shook. My pulse hammered. I felt like I had just triggered something irreversible. He called me back less than an hour later. "Cass," his voice lowered. The money changed hands several times. Classic laundering trail. Final transfer ends in Miami. Miami. A place for running. A place for forgetting. Elliot paused, then said, "I'm sending you a link. You need to see this." When the image opened, the air left my lungs. Anthony Reed, Miami Beach Marina, a yacht behind him, the sky bright, champagne bottle raised. And beside him, a blonde woman smiling, her hand wrapped around his arm like she belonged there. The caption beneath the photo was a punch to the gut. Living life to the fullest. My daughter lay half-broken beneath hospital lights while her husband toasted the sun. I stared until the image blurred. My jaw clenched so tightly that pain shot up the side of my head. For a long time, I didn't move, didn't blink, didn't breathe. There are certain truths the human mind rejects before it can accept. Cruelty, betrayal, the realization that the person you trusted with your child's heart never deserved it. When I finally set the phone down, something quiet settled inside me. Not rage, not grief, something colder. Resolve. I couldn't undo the crash, but I could stop the man responsible from using my daughter's money as fuel for his escape. The next morning, I called the bank. My voice was steady, too steady perhaps. The clerk asked for verification, then hesitated. "Are you certain?" she asked gently. "Yes," I said. "Freeze everything linked to Anthony and Natalia Reed." Within minutes, the accounts locked. The silence afterward felt like the eye of a storm. I had barely stepped back into the ICU when my phone rang. Anthony. His name glared at me from the screen like an accusation. I answered. His voice erupted immediately, furious, slurred, dripping entitlement. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" he shouted. "That money is mine." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. "You spent my daughter's savings on a woman and a yacht," I said quietly, "while she lies in a hospital bed fighting for her life." Static crackled through the line. He didn't speak for a heartbeat. Then rage returned, sharp and ugly. "You can't. You don't. You think you know everything." I ended the call before he finished. The ICU felt colder after that. The machines around Natalia hummed in the stillness. Her face looked peaceful, unaware of the war building around her. But that peace wouldn't last long. At 8:30 a.m., Elliot called again. His voice was clipped, serious. "Cass, listen," Miami airport security flagged him. He tried buying a one-way ticket to Cancun using Natalia's credit card. I closed my eyes. He wasn't just partying. He wasn't just careless. He was fleeing, running from consequences, running from a woman he nearly killed, running from a life that didn't serve him anymore. Hours later, while sorting through papers in Natalia's house, I found something that nearly stopped my heart. A folder, labeled insurance. Inside lay a policy worth $500,000. Beneficiary, Anthony Reed. Condition, Natalia's death. My blood ran cold. My fingers trembled around the paper. It wasn't proof, not yet, but it was a direction, and every direction pointed to the same horrifying truth. The crash was no accident. I returned to the hospital that night with the folder still in my bag. The ICU lights reflected off the linoleum, casting a pale halo around my daughter. I sat beside her, unable to stop staring at the faint rise and fall of her chest. "I'm here," I whispered. "I'm not going anywhere." The machines hummed like a distant promise. By morning, the promise broke because the police called. Anthony Reed had been caught in Key West, desperate and disheveled, trying to pay a fisherman to smuggle him to the Bahamas. When officers approached, he ran, sloppily, hopelessly, like a man who had spent all his courage long before the moment mattered. When I heard the news, relief didn't come, just a deep, tired ache. Justice had finally taken its first step. But justice isn't joy. It's a reckoning, a weight, a consequence. I returned to Natalia's room and sat quietly beside her. My fingers found her hand. Her skin felt warmer than before. She was still fighting, still here, still holding on. But now the truth was undeniable. The man she once loved had left her for dead, and now the world was finally closing in on him. This chapter ended not with triumph, but with a colder, quieter realization. The road to justice had begun, but the road to healing was still miles ahead. The day Natalia opened her eyes, the world didn't explode with celebration. There was no dramatic music, no sudden surge of hope. It was quiet, so quiet I thought I imagined it. Her fingers twitched beneath mine, a faint, almost ghost-like movement. I leaned in, holding my breath, afraid that if I blinked, the moment would vanish. Then her eyelids fluttered, weak, struggling, like someone trying to return from a place where light is only a rumor. Nat, my voice cracked. Sweetheart, I'm here. Her lips parted. A dry, trembling whisper slipped out, barely a breath. Dad. It was the softest sound I had ever heard, and yet it shattered me completely. Tears blurred my vision. I bowed my head over her hand and let years of fear, regret, and love spill out silently. For the first time since that terrible night, hope entered the room, not loudly, but as a fragile flicker trying to survive the darkness. The nurses rushed in. The monitors beeped faster. Voices overlapped, but all I could see was her. The faint rise of her chest, the confusion in her eyes, the fight beginning again. Recovery was slow. Days blurred into nights. Nights blurred into murmured encouragements, whispered prayers, and small miracles. She regained fragments of memory, pieces of the night that had broken her life apart. There was an argument, she whispered during one session, her fingers tightening around mine. He was angry about money, about some investment. Her voice shook as she spoke, each word dragging a memory with it. I told him to slow down, but he kept speeding. He kept saying, I didn't trust him. She swallowed hard. I remember him gripping the wheel, too tight. And then, her breath hitched. And then the world just shattered. I didn't tell her everything. Not yet. Not about Miami. Not about the yacht. Not about the woman. Not about the insurance folder with her name printed above a $500,000 payout. Some truths were weapons. Some truths were poison. Some truths a person should only confront when they are strong enough to stand. And she wasn't ready yet. But the justice system was. Weeks later, in a courtroom filled with cameras, murmurs, and the cold smell of polished wood, the man who had nearly killed my daughter walked in wearing a prison jumpsuit. Anthony Reed no longer looked like the polished businessman who once charmed a room with a handshake. His shoulders sagged. His hair was unkempt. The arrogance he used to wear like cologne had evaporated, replaced by a hollow, frightened uncertainty. Still, he refused to look at Natalia. He kept his eyes on the floor, like the truth was too bright to face. Natalia sat in front of me in her wheelchair, her body still weak, but her presence stronger than I had ever seen it. I rested my hands on her shoulders, feeling her tremble, feeling her breathe, feeling her face the man who had once vowed to protect her. When the prosecutor began reading the charges, DUI causing bodily harm, reckless endangerment, attempted insurance fraud, credit card fraud, the room shifted. Tension built like pressure in a sealed chamber. People watched him with judgment, with curiosity, with disgust. But I watched him with something else. A question I didn't want but couldn't escape. Was he truly a monster? Or was he a weak man who had drowned in his own failures? Anthony finally took the stand. His voice was uneven, cracking under the weight of every eye in the room. I didn't mean for any of this, he began. I lost control, not just of the car, but of my whole life. He talked about his father's death, how it left him hollow, desperate, reckless. He talked about his failing business, his pride, his inability to ask for help. He talked about drowning himself in alcohol to silence the panic he didn't know how to handle. He talked about the night of the crash, how anger and liquor had twisted together into a moment he could not take back. He wasn't crying, but his voice shook like a man breaking apart. For the first time, he didn't look like the grinning man on the yacht. He looked like someone who had been running from himself long before he ever ran from the law. The prosecutor cut in sharply. So you expect this court to believe, she said coldly, that empty bank accounts, a one-way ticket, credit card theft, and an insurance policy naming you as sole beneficiary were all coincidences. Anthony's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Silence filled the room. Thick, heavy, damning. Natalia squeezed my hand. Her breath shuddered. Her eyes filled, not with pity, but with something far more complicated. Hurt, betrayal, loss. I want to hate him. God, I wanted to. for leaving her bleeding in a twisted car, for drinking away his conscience, for choosing escape instead of her life. But as I watched him standing there, trembling and small, I felt something unexpected settle inside me. Not forgiveness, never forgiveness, but understanding. Some people destroy everything they love because they don't know how to hold anything without crushing it. He was guilty, but he was also broken. The verdict came that afternoon. Guilty on all counts. The gavel slammed down. The sound echoed like thunder rolling through the courtroom. Natalia cried silently, her shoulders shaking beneath my palms. Not from triumph. There was no triumph here. Only release. Only truth finally spoken aloud. Outside the courthouse, she looked up at me with eyes still damp but steady. "I don't want revenge," she whispered. "I just want peace." I cupped her cheek gently. "Justice isn't destruction," I told her. "It's restoration. It makes space for peace to grow again." Her lower lip trembled, but she nodded. "Then let's move forward," she whispered. "I don't want to carry him with me anymore." That night, long after she fell asleep, I found myself back in the hospital chapel, the place where I had once begged God to keep her alive. The room was almost unchanged. The same candle flickered near the altar, its flames swaying like a tired heartbeat. I sat in the silence, letting everything wash over me. The rage, the grief, the justice, the understanding, the quiet, painful truth that even justice cannot rebuild what life has broken. I realized something in that dim room. Strength isn't found in punishment. It's found in knowing when to let go, and in having the courage to rebuild from the rubble left behind. When I walked outside, dawn was stretching across the city, soft, forgiving, golden. Natalia slept peacefully when I returned to her room. For the first time since that terrible night, her breathing was steady, her dreams gentle, and inside me, something finally settled. The storm had passed. The reckoning was over. And now, for the first time in a long time, it was time to build again. 1 year can change a human life in ways no calendar can measure. Grief has its seasons. Healing has its storms. But time has a way of softening jagged edges, not by erasing them, but by teaching you how to run your fingers along the scars without bleeding. A year after the crash, the world finally felt breathable again. Not perfect, not restored, but livable. The air outside carried a gentler wind, and for the first time in a long while, I felt it touch my face without tightening my chest. The city seemed different too, not because it had changed, but because I had. When I walked down the familiar streets, I no longer looked for danger in every shadow. Instead, I watched the morning sun spill down glass buildings like a slow blessing. In that year, Natalia had become someone new, someone stronger than I ever imagined she could be. She had taken the broken pieces of her life and arranged them into something beautiful. She called it Blueprints of Hope. It stood on the edge of the city, in a quiet neighborhood where abandoned warehouses had once loomed like skeletons. She chose one of those old buildings, the kind most people drive past without a second glance. She said it reminded her of herself, forgotten, cracked, but holding the potential to rise again. The studio was painted in soft blues and creams, colors that whispered rather than shouted. Sunlight drifted through its wide windows, brushing over shelves filled with paints, brushes, clay bowls, and half-finished sculptures. Every wall held stories, drawn, sculpted, painted, by people who had been broken too, survivors of emotional abuse, victims of financial manipulation, people who had been betrayed by the hands that promised to protect them. Natalia welcomed them with open arms, her voice steady, gentle, and impossibly patient. The first time I saw her lead a workshop, I stood unnoticed in the back corner, watching her hands guide a trembling older woman through a clay exercise meant to release anxiety. Her words were soft but certain. "You don't have to make it perfect," she said. "Just make what your heart has been trying to say." The woman's shoulders dropped. Her breath steadied. Tears slid silently down her cheeks as her fingers pressed into the clay. And Natalia, she didn't flinch. She didn't turn away. She simply placed a hand on the woman's back, a gesture so quiet, so human, that it felt like architecture, a structure built not of steel, but of compassion. I realized, standing there, that my daughter had created something extraordinary, not just for herself, but for others lost in the same darkness she had once barely escaped. She wasn't surviving anymore. She was guiding. She was rebuilding, one story, one wound, one trembling hand at a time. Sometimes I would visit and sit in the back, blending into the quiet hum of the studio. I'd watch the way people looked at her, not with pity, but with gratitude, with awe, with the kind of respect reserved for someone who has walked through fire and come out carrying water for those still burning. She never told anyone the full story of her crash. She didn't need to. Her strength was explanation enough. One afternoon, she asked me to accompany her somewhere. We drove together in calm silence, the sun warm on the windshield. As we turned into the hospital parking lot, a familiar ache tightened in my chest. Memory, instinct, grief all tangled together. We walked through the same corridors that once felt like labyrinths of despair. The floors were still cold. The lights still flickered with that sterile brightness. But this time, they didn't feel cruel. A nurse at the front desk recognized Natalia immediately. She broke into a smile. "Look at you," she said warmly. "Walking in here like a miracle." Natalia laughed softly, the sound carrying a hint of disbelief, as if part of her still couldn't believe she had survived what was meant to destroy her. She handed the nurse a small envelope labeled for patient art therapy. The nurse's eyes softened as she accepted it. We continued walking until we reached the ICU wing, the same place where I had felt my soul unravel piece by piece. The same hallway where I had once stood praying for a single heartbeat. The same door behind which the machines had kept my daughter alive long enough for hope to return. The room was occupied now by someone else, a stranger fighting their own battle, a family facing their own darkness. We didn't go inside. We simply stood there, letting memory wash over us. Natalia reached for my hand. "Feels like another lifetime," she whispered. "It does," I said quietly. "But it's still part of us." We stayed there for a few seconds longer, time enough to honor the ghosts without letting them take up residence again. When we stepped outside, the sunlight fell across the pavement in bright shards. The new hospital wing, made of pale glass panels, caught the sun and shattered it into a mosaic of colors that danced across the ground beneath our feet. I stared at those reflections for a moment. In architecture, I'd always believed the strongest structures were the ones made of stone, steel, concrete, materials that weathered storms without bending. But sunlight taught me a different lesson that day. Strength isn't rigidity. Strength is transformation. Strength is the ability to take something harsh, something blinding, and scatter it into something beautiful. Natalia's voice pulled me back. "Do you ever think about rebuilding?" she asked softly. I looked at her, not at the scars on her body, not at the fragility that still lingered in her movements, but at the quiet resilience in her eyes. "I think," I said slowly, "that rebuilding isn't about starting over. It's about learning to live in the house that survived the storm." She smiled, not the small, hesitant smile she wore during the early months of recovery. This one was bright, real, warm. "Then I think we're doing okay," she whispered. We walked to the car together. The air smelled of blooming trees. Birds scattered across the sky in soft patterns. Somewhere in the distance, children laughed. Life, messy, unpredictable, beautiful, continued. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I didn't fear it. As we reached the car, I paused and looked at her studio glowing in the distance. People walked in and out of its doors with canvases tucked under their arms, with clay still soft on their fingers, with hope that looked freshly sketched. Natalia wasn't just living again. She had built a sanctuary where others could find their way back to themselves. She had created something that would outlast her pain, something bigger than the man who tried to break her. It hit me slowly, gently, with a warmth I hadn't expected. She had not just survived tragedy. She had designed a life that refused to be defined by it. And I, an architect who once believed only in steel and stone, finally understood that true resilience lives in the heart's capacity to rebuild after devastation. That afternoon, as sunlight spilled across her face, I realized this truth. She had become the blueprint I needed, a living reminder that strength is not found in what we build with our hands, but in what we rebuild inside ourselves. For the first time since the night the world fell apart, I felt whole again. And I knew, without question, without doubt, that no matter how long the shadows lingered, light would always find its way back in. In the end, life doesn't hand us perfect endings. It gives us moments, small, fragile, powerful, that shape who we become after the storm. Natalia survived. Justice was served. But survival is not the end of a story. It is the beginning of a new one. I look at her now, standing in that studio she built from her own broken pieces, and I see something I spent a lifetime designing but never truly understood. Strength. Not the kind measured in steel or concrete, but the kind that grows in silence, in truth, in the decision to rise again. If you felt even a flicker of recognition in this story, if a part of you has ever carried pain or betrayal or the weight of someone else's choices, then stay with us. These stories matter because they remind us we are not alone. None of us are. This is Casey and Williams, and this was the story that rebuilt me.